The evening glow painted the sky red, casting shadows over the quiet streets of Ashford, a peaceful suburb on the outskirts of New Haven. As the last rays of the day slowly faded, a small figure appeared from the deep alleyway behind the row of old houses on Oak Street. Kiki, an elderly Labrador hunting dog with a light brown coat and a muzzle tinged with silver, her dark eyes weary yet sharp, took slow, deliberate steps along the sidewalk. Her movements were gentle and patient, as if she had walked through countless years filled with memories. Kiki had once been a beloved hunting dog, pampered and adored by her owner. In the past, she lived in a cozy home with a family where afternoons were spent playing in the garden and enjoying delicious meals. But now, all of that was a distant memory, as her elderly owner had passed away, leaving the dog alone on the streets. Without a roof over her head, Kiki wandered from street to street, searching for something to sustain herself. Kiki's new life was full of challenges. While people still remembered the image of a beautiful and loyal dog, now she was just a stranger with fur covered in dirt, tired eyes, and claws scratched raw from trudging through desolate areas. In those endless days, she endured hunger and every cold night without shelter. Many people, seeing the poor dog, tried to approach and take her in. Some intended to bring her to shelters, but Kiki always managed to escape. Once, a stranger tried to coax her closer, intending to capture her. But Kiki, with the instincts of a dog who had once been loved, sensed the danger and fled. As night fell, the city's cold seemed to sharpen. Kiki huddled in the dark corners of empty streets, seeking warmth in trash piles or beneath old cars. Those long, unforgettable nights drained the old dog's strength. Yet, in her bright, alert eyes, there remained a determination that was not easily crushed. One stormy night, heavy raindrops hit Kiki's face, soaking her fur, her eyes blurred with rainwater. The rumble of the storm surrounded her, but amidst the chaos, she suddenly heard a faint cry coming from somewhere in the dark. It was the cry of a baby, sweet, startled, as if lost in the pitch-black night. Despite being exhausted and drained, Kiki couldn't ignore the weak cry for help. She began running towards the sound, hoping she could assist, even though she was just a homeless, old dog with nothing but loyalty and unconditional love. The rain grew heavier and the streets became slippery. Kiki took careful steps, each paw pressing firmly against the road to avoid slipping. When the dog was near, suddenly a car sped toward her from the front, unable to stop in time. Before she could react, Kiki heard the sound of the car's horn blaring, followed by a forceful impact that sent her body flying, landing motionless on the wet road. The rain poured down on Kiki, and the screeching sound of the car seemed to echo in the dark night, never fading away. At that moment, Kiki felt as though the entire world was spinning, everything around her becoming a blur. The old dog, who had endured so many hardships, truly didn't know if she would survive this time. However, amidst the deadly silence of the rainy night, the baby's cries continued to ring out, an endless call for help. It was the only thing that kept Kiki fighting to rise from the ground, despite her aching, exhausted body. With one last ounce of strength, Kiki clung to every breath, finding a way to stand, blood trickling from the wound beneath her soaked fur. She couldn't give up, couldn't abandon her mission. The baby's cry was the only reason Kiki struggled through the pain, moving closer to hope, to a love that had never faded. Weak and in agony, Kiki fought to stand, her trembling legs threatening to give way at any moment. The rain still poured heavily, each drop hammering against her body, soaking her fur and making it clump together. Her wounds stung, but what hurt more than anything was the look from the driver. A man, his face flushed red with anger, stood next to the car, glaring at Kiki with a look filled with hatred and frustration. At that moment, Kiki was nothing more than a fragile shadow, her emaciated body shaking, her brown eyes filled with rain and pain. Her expression was a mix of confusion and suffering, as if she couldn't understand why she was being treated this way. Her ears drooped, the faint scars from past struggles standing out more clearly under the dim light of the car. But Kiki no longer had the strength to resist or run away. She simply stood there, her eyes wide and full of pain, like a silent plea, as if begging for mercy from the man. The man shouted angrily, his words sharp as knives, but Kiki didn't understand. She could only stumble with each step, looking up at him, her gaze no different than that of a helpless child searching for a bit of kindness. Kiki stood still, unable to move, feeling nothing but the sense of being lost and abandoned in the cold rain and the harshness of the world around her. After what felt like an eternity, the pain in Kiki's body began to numb, but her will to survive refused to be crushed. Slowly, painfully, Kiki tried to stand, step by step. As the raindrops continued to batter her face and her weary body dragged itself forward, she heard the baby's cry again, this time clearer, coming from a nearby dumpster. The cry was not that of a dog, but of a baby. Kiki's vision was clouded with rain and exhaustion, but at that moment, she heard the sound like an invisible call. Without thinking, Kiki knew the baby needed help, and only she could provide it. She stumbled toward the dumpster, a powerful, unexplainable feeling rising within her. Step by step, she passed through the scattered trash, and in a brief moment of difficulty, she spotted a small figure curled up within, its face drenched and eyes brimming with tears. Though she had no energy left, Kiki used every last bit of her strength to pull the baby out of the cold pile of garbage. The warmth from the baby, fragile and weak, sparked a new energy in Kiki. She placed the baby on her back, each step heavy but determined, even as the pain and exhaustion gnawed at her body. Kiki had only one goal now, to get the baby to safety. Not far away, there was an old house tucked away on the corner of the street. Elderly Nurse Elizabeth, who had lived in the area for over 70 years, was the only person Kiki knew who could help the baby. Nurse Elizabeth was not only a seasoned nurse, but also a strong woman who had cared for many patients, from the elderly to sick children. She had dedicated her life to helping others, and because of that, she was loved and respected by the entire community. Kiki walked up to the door of the house, cautiously stopping for a moment to gather strength, then gently knocked. The soft sound echoed in the dark night. After a while, the door opened, and elderly Mrs. Elizabeth appeared. Her face showed a brief surprise upon seeing Kiki carrying the baby on its back, but within an instant, understanding and compassion filled her eyes, replacing her initial shock. She quickly opened the door wider, reaching out to take the baby, her gaze fixed on Kiki with gratitude and concern. "Thank you, my dog," Mrs. Elizabeth whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Thank you for saving this baby." Kiki, with tired eyes but still full of determination, sat at her feet, watching as the baby was carefully tended to in Mrs. Elizabeth's gentle embrace. Although its body was exhausted, Kiki felt a sense of relief in its heart. It had done the right thing, and at least in that moment, Kiki no longer felt alone. Mrs. Elizabeth quickly placed the baby on the table, checking its weak breaths. The child was so small, freezing and frail, but she wasted no time. She grabbed a warm blanket, wrapping it around the baby to keep it warm, and hurriedly dialed 911. "Oh, God, please help," Mrs. Elizabeth said urgently as the phone connected. "911, what's your emergency?" The voice of the 911 operator sounded calm, yet full of concern. "There's a baby, very small and weak. I found it in a trash bin, possibly abandoned. It's breathing weakly and showing signs of hypothermia. Please send an ambulance to my address on Pine Street." "Understood. An ambulance is on the way. Please keep the baby in your arms. Try to keep it warm and avoid any further deterioration. We'll be there shortly." While Mrs. Elizabeth swiftly administered first aid to the baby, Kiki stood beside them, its eyes never leaving the two. The old dog still stood there, its brown eyes full of worry, intently watching every movement of Mrs. Elizabeth and the baby. Even though its body was soaked, its fur matted from the rain, and its stomach growling with hunger, Kiki didn't leave the baby's side. The fear was clear on its face, as though it couldn't take its eyes off the baby it had saved. Mrs. Elizabeth, noticing Kiki's concern, quickly turned back. She hurriedly grabbed a towel, gently wiping Kiki's body, then brought a bowl of warm food to the dog. Kiki smelled the food, but couldn't tear its eyes away from the baby, as though it still had to protect it. Mrs. Elizabeth gently sat down beside Kiki, patting the dog. "Thank you, Kiki. You did so well," she said softly. Then she grabbed a hairdryer, carefully drying Kiki's wet fur. Despite being exhausted and drained, Kiki sat still, its gaze never leaving the baby. After a while, when Kiki's fur had dried somewhat, Mrs. Elizabeth returned to the baby, placing a warm blanket on the dog, as if she wanted Kiki to feel safe and cared for. Kiki took a deep breath, feeling the warmth spread through its body, but its heart was still filled with worry for the baby it had rescued. A little while later, the ambulance arrived, and the medical team quickly took the baby inside, rushing it to the nearest hospital. The police also arrived immediately, beginning their investigation and searching for the baby's parents. After some research and verification, they discovered that the baby's mother was a young girl named Aria, just 18 years old. Aria was an outstanding student, excelling in a class with dreams of becoming a doctor. She was intelligent, always achieving high marks, and had planned to apply to medical school. However, one mistake at a party changed everything. One night, in a drunken and thoughtless moment, Aria was persuaded and crosses a boundary with a young man, resulting in an unexpected pregnancy. When Aria discovered she was pregnant, she felt desperate and afraid. She feared that if her family found out, she would disappoint them. Her parents, who had always had high expectations for her, would never accept it. She also feared that the pregnancy would ruin all her dreams and chances of getting into college. So Aria decided to hide everything, giving birth alone in her bedroom without anyone knowing. But she couldn't keep the secret forever. The truth about the baby had been exposed, and now Aria had to face the consequences she never could have anticipated. When Aria walked into the hospital room, her eyes immediately locked on her tiny child, lying in the crib and being carefully tended to. The baby was more stable now, with some color returning to her skin, and her breathing more even. Aria approached, her heart tightening in her chest, as she could no longer hold back the waves of guilt and sorrow. Mrs. Elizabeth stood beside her, gently patting Arya's shoulder to offer comfort. "Your baby was saved in time, thanks to a very special hero," she said, her eyes warm yet full of emotion. Arya looked up, her tear-filled eyes meeting Mrs. Elizabeth. Thank you for saving my baby. I don't know how to thank you," she choked out, her voice thick with grief. Mrs. Elizabeth smiled softly, brushing her hair back. "You don't need to thank me. It's Kiki who deserves the thanks." She turned and looked at Kiki, the dog lying beside the crib, still full of concern, but also gentle in its manner. Arya followed Mrs. Elizabeth's gaze, her eyes widening as she saw Kiki quietly lying, protecting the baby. She staggered forward, kneeling down, and hugged the dog. "Thank you, Kiki. Thank you for saving my baby," Arya said, tears streaming down her face. Kiki looked up at Arya with deep, understanding eyes, letting out a brief, "Whew. Sorry." That simple sound, despite its simplicity, was filled with sincerity, making everyone smile through their tears. Arya tears still clung to her face, but a faint smile tugged at her lips as she heard Kiki's soft woof. Mrs. Elizabeth stood by, unable to hold back a laugh. "Ooh, I think Kiki is saying, 'No need to thank me,'" she said with a gentle, emotional look. "He just wants to see everyone happy." Arya looked at Kiki, her eyes shining with emotion. The dog, despite not being able to speak like a human, had communicated everything through its actions. Kiki not only saved the baby's life, but also brought hope and faith to Arya, to Mrs. Elizabeth, and to everyone who witnessed the dog's bravery. Kiki gave another soft woof, as if agreeing, then gently wagged its tail, looking at Arya with eyes full of affection. There was a warmth in the room, as if Kiki had become an inseparable part of the story of the baby and of Arya. Though just a small dog, Kiki's actions had taught everyone a lesson in courage, sacrifice, and unconditional love. In the end, after things had calmed down, Mrs. Elizabeth decided to do what she felt was right. Throughout the time she had spent caring for the baby, she had not only felt the boundless love from Kiki, but also a sense of responsibility tied to the fate of this poor child. After learning more about Arya's situation, she decided she wouldn't let the baby live in loneliness, nor would she allow Kiki to roam alone anymore. Mrs. Elizabeth adopted both Kiki and baby, bringing them to live with her in the small house where she had spent the last 70 years, a decision that she knew would change all their lives. The social welfare agency also recognized her dedication and kindness, quickly providing the necessary support. They gave Mrs. Elizabeth allowances to help care for the baby and Kiki. She no longer had to worry about money, and now she could devote all her love to both of them. Arya, despite still being filled with regret and sorrow for what she had done, knew that her baby would be raised in a loving and caring environment. She also sensed a change within herself, realizing that although the past couldn't be changed, she could still rebuild her life. With the help of Mrs. Elizabeth, Arya decided to continue her education and begin rebuilding her dreams, setting an example for her young daughter. Every morning, Mrs. Elizabeth, the baby, and Kiki would enjoy peaceful moments together. The baby began to grow up under the care, love, and protection of Mrs. Elizabeth and Kiki, the loyal dog always by her side. Kiki, with bright eyes and soft fur, was no longer a stray dog, but an irreplaceable part of the family. The dog brought joy and comfort, even with a simple woof. The story of Kiki and the baby became a small legend in the area, proving that sometimes the greatest miracles come from simple acts and unconditional love. The story of Kiki, the brave old dog, and the poor baby opened a profound message about compassion, sacrifice, and unconditional love. Although a dog, Kiki not only saved a life, but also changed the lives of many people, bringing them hope, empathy, and a reminder that every good deed, no matter how small, can create significant change. Through this story, we learn that sometimes the quietest people, the creatures we think cannot bring anything significant, can actually be true heroes. And like Kiki, love doesn't always need grand words. Sometimes it's just a heartfelt woof. Above all, this story teaches us about connection and responsibility. Mrs. Elizabeth, although she had lived a simple life, chose to share unconditional love when she adopted both the baby and Kiki. Each of us, no matter how many difficulties or challenges we face, can create positive change for others if we open our hearts and act from a place of love. In the end, this story reminds us that every life is valuable and deserves care and protection. Even in the most difficult times, love and compassion will always be the light guiding us, helping us overcome challenges and find hope in the simplest things. Therefore, always believe in the power of kindness, whether it comes from four-legged friends or hearts willing to share.